Prayer for my daughter for 2537 Ireland in Revolution. Last time we looked at the Second Coming, Yeats's apocalyptic poem, in which he applies his own private mythology of the historical process to the events of 1919, surveying world history from an Irish point of view and refracting his concerns for Ireland through world history. In 1917, Yeats had married George Hyde, and on their honeymoon, she had begun automatic writing. This became one of the most important sources of creative ferment for Yeats, who believed that he was in communication with the spirit world through his partner, what he calls in Second Coming the Spiritus Mundi. One of the reasons why he's able to perform the role of seer or visionary in that poem is because at this point in his life, he had a direct route to the other side, as he believed it. And I gave you some excerpts from his book of Vision, a work of private mythology, a hermetically sealed world that he believed was an accurate reflection of the world historical process generally, a kind of involuted process, a centrifugal then centripetal oscillation. And so the point of the Second Coming, using the language of Christian revelation, was to suggest that the soil of Christian ferment was exhausted and that there was a new revelation at hand, a second coming that would put an end to the Christian period of world history. But what it was to be replaced with was something terrifying and uncertain. This rough beast that he talks about at the end of that poem. You'll see how the Second Coming and A Prayer for My Daughter share a number of concerns. You can see, for example, the word cradle at the very end of A Second Coming and the cradle at the very beginning of A Prayer for My Daughter. So as different as these two poems are at a first reading, and they are at a first reading extraordinarily different, they are both concerned with anxieties around birth, rebirth, one pitched at the level of the family, the other at the level of civilization itself. But they're also interested in that preoccupation / obsession of Yeats's, which is degeneration. The notion that he had gleaned from the fin de siècle that civilization was in decline. Everywhere at this time in the post-Victorian world that one looked, the Victorian myths of progress, civilization, enlightenment, enfranchisement, the liberal theory of capitalism as the perfect society, all of this was disintegrating on the battlefields of the Somme, out in the Russian steppes, and of course at home in Ireland, with the 1916 Rising after the Land War and leading to the War of Independence, then Civil War, and so forth. There was also the Spanish flu pandemic, relevant to us today. And at the time that The Second Coming was written, George, Yeats's partner, who was pregnant with his daughter, as it would turn out, with his child, had Spanish flu. So that the sense of degeneration theory as a kind of ambient source of infection of the individual and of the body politic more generally is everywhere in these poems. So Yeats is turning to the mythological process of his visions in order to try and domesticate cosmic fear, in order to try and narrate and contain, whilst also exaggerating the impact and significance of imminent apocalypse. In A Prayer for My Daughter, and we've seen how a number of words from Second Coming carry over, cradle most obviously, but that notion in the first stanza of the Second Coming that the ceremony of innocence is drowned is also relevant to a prayer for my daughter, where at the end of the poem we can see that he talks about his hopes that his daughter will be brought to a house where all is accustomed and ceremonious, that this notion of custom and ceremony and innocence return in these poems. So it's important, or at least useful, to read them beside each other. They are two ruminations on the same predicament. A world that is disintegrating at the level of sense-making attempts to understand it. The apocalyptic eschatology of the Second Coming has its own domestic version in Irish society and politics, but it's refracted through the notion of fertility. One of the things that Yeats was concerned about increasingly in his work was the rise of Catholic Ireland. At the time of Kathleen Ni Houlihan, he felt that there was available to the Irish people a non-sectarian or even implicitly Protestant Republican tradition that could be used to create a nation beyond ethnic division. Now, this may have been somewhat fanciful, given the extraordinary and increasing grip of the Catholic Church on Irish social life after 1870. 1870 and after, which is the period of the Land War, is also the period of what was called Ireland's devotional revolution. In broad strokes, the theory is something along the lines of, because English colonialism, British imperialism, had been avowedly Protestant and even Puritan, that the nationalism that rose up in Ireland to contest and displace that imperialism was almost inevitably going to look for some way to differentiate itself from Protestant imperialism, and so it became an avowedly Catholic nationalism. At the same time, after the famine, after the megadeath of the famine, 1 million dead, rotting bodies, and more than 1 million emigrating, followed by catastrophic decline through emigration and displacement. That this psychic wound in the Irish people left an abyss. And as is in the case in most catastrophic events in history, including the Black Death in Europe, the Irish people, casting about for an explanation, tended to domesticate the contingency of the event by attributing it to a deity, to God, to punishment, so that the Irish internalized the idea that on some level, the famine had been sent to teach them a lesson about how they were living. And this was also the message that the British government, through the Treasury, had put out by their policy of laissez-faire economics and non-intervention in the market. Malthusian economics, the idea of overpopulation inevitably outstripping supply, was in the air. And the idea was that God had sent a check on the Irish people in order to punish them for their feckless fecundity. Catholicism having made contraception illegal in the church, it was held that Irish fertility was unsustainable and that nature or God or both, God's nature, had spoken. So it's not surprising that Roman Catholicism filled the gap in the Irish psyche and soul, left by the famine and left by colonialism. For a dispossessed people, the message that those who have nothing now shall inherit the earth was at least comforting. And there's a sense in which Catholicism spoke to the Irish psyche by way of predisposed need. It gave them a way to rationalize dispossession and was a resource of hope in an ongoing colonial struggle with Protestant imperialism and Englishness, Reformation culture. So in The Second Coming, it's clearly a poem that speaks to the world process. Mere anarchy being some kind of disintegration of the world order per se. But we also saw how, through the 19th century Land Act cartoons of Punch Anarchy was often emblazoned across the hat of the simian apes of the Irish Republican and land war movements, so that there's always an Irish context to Yeats's global outlook, just as Yeats's global outlook is always refracted through an Irish context. You could say that there's a centrifugal, centripetal play in Yeats's perspective that he then projects onto world history. So here in the first poem, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. One possible reading of this in the light of Irish fertility is about the crisis of Protestant fertility versus Catholic fecundity. That the best is obviously the Protestants, and we remember this from Upon a House Shaken by the Land agitation, the best knitted to the best. All that language of birds of prey and animal husbandry, the falcon and the falconer, the idea of genetic fitness and inheritance, the best being contaminated by the worst. Well, in Ireland, if the worst was the Catholic majority, the simian apes of the anarchy, and they are exhibiting the highest levels of fertility in Europe and across the world at one point, second, I believe, only to Albania, then it's not difficult for somebody who believes in degeneration theory and its respectable scientific cousin eugenics to suggest that one of the problems that Ireland has is a problem of reproduction, sexual and social reproduction, the wrong kind of people having too many children, 7, 8, 9, 10 in a family, whereas the Protestants were having 1.2 children in good Protestant fashion and being outbred by their Catholic counterparts. I suggested last week that Yeats is once again apprehending reality post facto, in the sense that he becomes interested in land agitation in a poem in 1910, but the land agitation had been successfully concluded in the favor of the Irish peasantry in 1903 with the Wyndham Land Act. And here he begins to become preoccupied with Protestant fertility in Ireland, right as the Protestant population goes off a cliff in demographic terms, from which it never recovers. You simply cannot expect 4% of the population, as they were to be in a partitioned Ireland, the lonely 4% of the Protestant minority in little poke holes in Greystones and parts of Dublin and Cork and Galway City and Offaly. These were little pockets of Protestant endurance in a now vocal, highly politicized Catholic nation to become and to be. And so the idea that the Protestants were somehow going to breed their way out of crisis was dubious to say the least. The other thing about birth politics and fertility around this notion of passionate intensity of Catholic sex versus the lack of conviction of Protestant sex is this question of what is actually going to be born, the rough beast. And here we see again the specter of degeneration. Degeneration, as we have seen, is a theory about form, about proper form and deformity. It's about genetic fitness and unfitness. Wastrels, vagabonds, prostitutes, alcoholics, people with disabilities, degenerates of all kinds, loafers, tramps, unemployables, Jews. The list goes on, precisely because the category of degenerate has no positive content. It can be populated with anything that isn't what you think it ought to be. Yeats was an ableist. He believed in fitness and form. And he was having an argument here, as I suggested last week, with Max Nordau about the forms that art should take. Max Nordau, we remember, wrote a book called Degeneration, in which he diagnosed the decline of civilization through the lens of literature and showed how literature of the world, and he included people like the French symbolists, the pre-Raphaelite painters, the Impressionists, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Ibsen, Wilde. In fact, almost all of the great writers of the period were for Nordau symptomatic of degeneration. And the problem for Yeats was that Yeats was profoundly convinced of the degeneration hypothesis, but his own artwork, his early Celtic revival work particularly, stank of degeneration, in the sense that Nordau had said that symbolism, symbolist poets, was a sign of mind fog, that they couldn't be clear about what they meant, so they just used words to indicate their confusion or to obfuscate it. And this is exactly what Yeats had been accused of doing in his early poetry with his symbols of the rose and the red bordered hem and so forth. That in other words, Yeats was convinced of the degeneration hypothesis, and yet his own art seemed to be a symptom of degeneration. Was he then himself a symptom of the decline that he was keen to diagnose elsewhere? How to deal with this problem? And one answer was to split his perspective. The other, as we've seen, was to consciously cultivate a clearer, sharper, artistic style. And that's why we see Yeats from around 1906 or 7 beginning to write in a more direct, clear, and as he called it, manly style. He was worried all of a sudden that his early work was indeed an index of mysticism and degeneration a la Nordau, and so he determined to change his style in order to ameliorate the degenerate aspect of his own art. He talks in a letter to George Russell from 1904 about his early lyric work as an exaggeration of sentiment and sentimental beauty, which I have come to think unmanly. I have been fighting the prevalent decadence for years and have but just got it underfoot in my own heart. It is sentiment and sentimental sadness, a womanish introspection. This region of shadows is full of false images of the spirit and of the body. I have come to feel towards it as O'Grady feels towards it sometimes, and even a little as some of my stupidest critics feel. As so often happens with a thing one has been tempted by, and is still a little tempted by, I am roused by it to a kind of frenzied hatred. I believe more strongly every day that the element of strength in poetic language is common idiom, just as the element of strength in poetic construction is common passion. You can see the language is still the language of the Second Coming 15 years later. Passion, precision, frenzy, control. Yeats is trying to figure out a way to fight the degenerate tendencies in himself, the mystical, womanish, Celticist, magical. He wants to cultivate rationality, but he's at the same time in touch with the spirit world, the spiritus mundi. So how do you talk about a region of shadows that is full of false images of the spirit and of the body, and then 15 years later claim to have overcome that whilst talking about a vast image out of spiritus mundi that troubles my sight, a shape with line body and the head of a man, and so forth. The point being that Yeats is split. He's in an argument with himself. There's the man and there's the masks. There's the artist he is and the artist he is in the process of becoming. And all of this is relevant to A Prayer for My Daughter. I've posted a reading of the poem separately in a file, so now I'm just going to say a few things about the poem itself. First of all, we can say that it begins or opens under conditions of threat. This beautiful line, once more the storm is howling, and half hid under this cradle hood and cover lid, my child sleeps on. So that the figure of the storm, the repeated storm, is a figure of the conditions of threat under which this child is going to persist. And that storm is of a literal storm in the west of Ireland, brought on by Irish shit weather. But it's also a metaphorical storm, the storm of world events as diagnosed in the Second Coming, and of course, the coming war of independence in Ireland. So that Yeats is responding to conditions of threat. The child is only half hid under the cradle hood and cover lid. And there is no obstacle but Gregory's wood, whereby the haystack and roof levelling wind can be stayed. Gregory's Wood is Lady Gregory's Wood, the woods of Coole Park, his favourite aristocratic place of pretension, where he would go and play aristocrat with Lady Gregory. They had colluded, or is colluded the word? Collaborated on Kathleen Ni Houlihan. And increasingly, Lady Gregory's femininity, her version of femininity, served as an ideal for Yeats of how Protestant women should behave. Yeats was convinced, as we saw in On a Political Prisoner, that politics marred women's natural beauty and morality, and that Constance Markievicz, as an aristocrat who had joined the Irish Republican and socialist movements, had been all but destroyed by her engagement with politics. Her coming back to her own nature had been achieved involuntarily by her confinement in prison. And it was in prison that she began to recover her nature, to the extent that in one of Yeats's favorite images, a bird landing on the hand, as in The Falcon and the Falconer, and as we'll see here in A Prayer for My Daughter, around the linnet in the tree. That, in other words, Yeats likes his birds confined, and that includes Lady Gregory, happily confined on the estate of Coole Park, and increasingly, as we'll see in this poem, his vision for his daughter is that she will take up the mantle of Gregory rather than the mantle of Constance Markievicz or Maud Gonne. He wants her to avoid an active life of politics. The frenzied drum and the murderous innocence of the sea and the excited reverie is an aspect of Yeats's vision of what's coming in the future. And this notion of the tower is the house Tuair Ballaleigh, which was an old tower that he had bought and renovated at great expense and extravagance, close to Lady Gregory's Coole Park, in order to cultivate his own aristocratic pretensions. It nearly bankrupted the family, but it was a massively important symbol for him of a number of things, including an index of his own growing siege mentality in Catholic Ireland. We saw how he turned on the Irish people once he saw that they were not biddable on his own terms, and pathologized them as mean-spirited, obsessed with money, prayer, and pence. So that the tower is his house, but it's also a symbol of entrenchment and defense. And here is where he's going to raise his child. And this poem is nothing if not an argument about keeping your women safe. He goes on then to talk about her in relationship to beauty. And this is where some of the most messed up aspects of the poem come into focus. Yeats was convinced that Maud Gonne, the love of his life, was too beautiful for her own good, and that her beauty had prevented her from developing a moral conscience. May she be granted beauty, and yet not beauty to make a stranger's eye distraught, or hers before a looking glass. And the problem with this excessive beauty, as Yeats suggests in this poem, is that it screws you up as a person morally, but it also affects your ability to have proper relationships. And, as he puts it here, the heart-revealing intimacy that chooses right. In other words, choosing the right life partner. You remember that Yeats had been jilted by Maud Gonne, who then went on to marry Sean MacBride, who covered himself in glory by dying in the 1916 executions after the Rising, but who had been, by all accounts, a difficult and unpleasant man, but a man of action, and the kind of man that Maud Gonne felt more turned on by. So that Yeats is once again here working through his own indignation, disappointment, and confusion about his relationship with Gonne by making her an antitype of what he hopes for his daughter. He wants his daughter to be beautiful, but not too beautiful, because that might make her choose the wrong person. And that's essentially, I'm going to say, what this whole poem is about. Yeats's prayer for his daughter is a prayer that she makes the right kind of choice, chooses the right Protestant partner, and ultimately has the right kind of Protestant babies in a Protestant house full of Protestant values. He goes then on to Greek mythology. Helen, being chosen, found life flat and dull, and later had much trouble from a fool. While that great queen that rose out of the spray, being fatherless, could have her way, yet chose a bandy-legged smith for man. So he's saying here that women don't always make, beautiful women, the right kind of partner choice. And the notion of the bandy-legged smith here brings us again to the spectre of degeneration. After all, how could it be right for a beautiful woman to marry deformity? Yeats is constantly on the lookout for degeneration as an aspect of form. The notion of the rough beast in the Second Coming is here again shadowed by the prospect of a marriage with a degenerate or a deformed individual, linking to Greek mythology and to Aphrodite's choice of partner. And it's because when women eat a crazy salad with their meat that the horn of plenty is undone. In other words, women have the power through their object choice, through their partner choice, to undermine social order. This is a very authoritarian poem in its apparent concern for Yeats's daughter. And Yeats, as he grows older, gets more and more authoritarian with age, more and more convinced that sexual and social reproduction are intimately linked, and in order to control the one, you have to dictate the terms of the other. So he goes on to talk about the kind of traits she should have, courtesy, and so forth. It's a cult of femininity as the passive object of the male gaze and male adoration. That activity for Yeats is something that makes women lose touch with their best selves. In fact, he goes on, as we see, to envisage his daughter plonked in the ground and going nowhere, not even moving. May she become a flourishing hidden tree, rooted in one dear perpetual place. This is another poem then, like On a Political Prisoner, about women and confinement, and how confinement is good for women and good for men in relation to women, and hence good for the family and society more generally. And as the Marjorie Howes reading that's on Brightspace tells you, for Yeats at this period, he's trying to argue for the good Protestant family as a microcosm for the ideal Irish nation. That she has no business but dispensing round their magnanimities of sound. This is exactly the kind of thing that Ibsen had parodied and mocked in A Doll's House with all of Torvald's talk about Nora as a squander bird and a squirrel and a lark, making out that twittering and tweeting was the business of the female mind. As an index of sexual politics, it couldn't be more condescending and paternalist. And here he goes on to refer back to the fate of Maud Gonne. He had met Maud Gonne again recently around the time of this poem and thought that she looked terrible. So he was more and more convinced that she had lost her way as a function of her extraordinary beauty and her intense Republican politics. My mind, because the minds that I have loved, the sort of beauty that I have approved, prosper but little, has dried up of late, yet knows that to be choked with hate may well be of all evil chances chief. So that hatred is what happens to people who get involved in politics, particularly women. And hatred is the thing that distorts the mind, tearing the linnet from the leaf. So here again we see an image of birds in their communion with humans in relation to nature as an image of stable society. An intellectual hatred is the worst, so let her think opinions are accursed. And here's Maud Gonne again. Have I not seen the loveliest woman born out of the mouth of plenty's horn, because of her opinionated mind, barter that horn and every good by quiet natures understood, for an old bellows full of angry wind? Considering that, he then moves to his conclusion, all hatred driven hence, the soul recovers radical innocence. This is the very ceremony of innocence that is in danger of being drowned in the second coming. And here it's embodied in his daughter and in his conviction that if she avoids conviction, she will actually fulfill not just her duties to society, but her potential as a woman. He wants her to be self-delighting, self-appeasing, self-affrighting, which is a paradox in a poem in which she has to take all of her bidding from the patriarchal mores of a society. And this shows you how the poem is largely incoherent on its own terms. But that doesn't matter. We're not looking for our art to be entirely coherent. In many ways, great art proliferates in contradiction. It's what we do with our confusion that makes art meaningful. Propaganda and politics and certainty are the opposite of art in this sense. And then the poem concludes and in many ways lays its cards on the table. This is what the whole thing has been about. He's seeing his daughter as a uterus with potential. And in the same way that Maud Gonne went off the rails when she married MacBride and got involved in the Republican struggle, his daughter can go off the rails by marrying outside of the clan. He wants his daughter to be a little bit or a lot like Lady Gregory. And may her bridegroom bring her to a house where all's accustomed, ceremonious. For arrogance and hatred are the wares peddled in the thoroughfares, and that's Catholic Ireland again, those little streets hurled upon the great, from those poems like September 1913, from that middle period where Yeats turns with all of his astonishing viciousness on the people that he had presumed to lead. How but in custom and in ceremony are innocence and beauty born? Ceremony is a name for the rich horn, and custom for the spreading laurel tree. So that's a prayer for my daughter. And as you can see, Yeats is having an argument with himself about freedom for his daughter and her duties to the Protestant minorities in Ireland. It's a quixotic attempt to suggest that Anglo-Ireland is in crisis, a crisis of reproduction that is sexual and social, and that if Protestant Ireland is to endure, its women have to behave, including his daughter. It's a kind of a physical and moral map of her future as ordained by the demands of her people rather than any individualist culture, which is in contradistinction, as we've seen, to the notion that she could be self-delighting, self-appeasing, or self-affrighting. Rather, what Yeats is hoping for here is that she will be so well raised that her desires for herself will become identical with Anglo-Ireland's needs of her. In other words, that she will internalize the patriarchal culture of propriety and Anglo-Irishness as her own desire. And what more profound domination can we imagine than a domination so total that it feels like freedom to the dominated?